Maybe my daughter thought I wouldn't notice, or maybe she assumed that at 68 I'd stop paying attention to the details of my own home. Either way, she was wrong on both counts. I found out on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd been to my book club that afternoon. We meet every second Tuesday at the library on Elgin Street, and I came home a little later than usual, maybe 4:15. The light in the front hallway was on when it shouldn't have been. I keep things a certain way. I always have. I turned it off when I left at noon, and I knew I turned it off. I set my bag down by the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, just listening. The house has a particular silence when it's empty. 31 years in a house and you know its silences. This wasn't one of them. There were shoes by the stairs that weren't mine. Men's shoes. Size 11 at least. Dark brown leather. The kind you'd wear to an office. I stood there looking at them the way you look at something that doesn't belong, turning it over in your mind, waiting for an explanation to arrive. None came. I walked to the kitchen. There was a coffee cup in my sink. Not my mug, the tall ceramic one my late husband Gerald had bought me years ago at a craft fair in Perth. This was a plain white mug, the kind that comes in a set of 8 from Canadian Tire. It had been rinsed but not washed. Someone had been considerate enough to rinse it and inconsiderate enough not to wash it. I went upstairs. The door to the back bedroom, the room that had been Gerald's study, the room I hadn't changed much in 7 years, was closed. I always leave it open. The smell of a closed room in a house is a particular kind of loneliness, and I'd learned to keep that door open as a small mercy to myself. It was closed. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. Then I knocked, because I am, apparently, the kind of person who knocks on doors in her own house. A man's voice said, "Just a minute." I cannot describe to you exactly what I felt in that moment. It wasn't quite fear, and it wasn't quite anger. It was something colder than both. The feeling of something being taken that you hadn't even realized you'd had. The assumption of safety in your own home. The baseline trust that when you turn a key in your own lock, you are entering a space that is entirely and unambiguously yours. The door opened. A young man, mid-30s, dark hair, wearing a button-down shirt that looked freshly pressed. He looked at me with the polite blankness of someone who has been told to expect me. Not surprised. Just waiting. "You must be Colette," he said. "I must be Colette," he said. "I must be Colette. In my own house." "I am," I said. "And you are." His name was Andrew. He worked in tech, had recently relocated from Vancouver for a contract position downtown, and was looking for a place while he sorted out a longer-term arrangement. He said all of this in the easy, practiced tone of someone who has introduced himself this way several times already. My daughter had not told me any of this. I asked Andrew to excuse me. I closed the door gently because none of this was Andrew's fault, and I went downstairs and I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring, which meant she wasn't surprised to hear from me either. "Mum," she said, before I'd spoken a word, not a greeting, a bracing. I asked her to explain to me what I had just found in Gerald's study. There was a pause. Then she said, "I was going to tell you. I've heard those words before. Everyone has. They are the words people say when they know what they did was wrong, but would like to be credited for the intention they never acted on. I was going to tell you. I was going to ask you. I was going to consider your feelings at some point in the future, before circumstances made that inconvenient." She told me she'd been thinking about it for a while. The house was too big for one person. I was rattling around in it. The back room sat empty. Andrew was the husband of a colleague, newly arrived in Ottawa, and he needed a place for 3 months, just 3 months, and she'd thought it would be good for me, actually. The company, someone in the house, and the money, $800 a month. She'd been depositing it directly into my account because she thought, "You've already taken money," I said. Silence. How many months? 2. $1,600. Collected. Deposited. Already 2 months of a decision my daughter had made about my home, my space, the room where my husband used to sit in the evenings reading, without asking me a single question. Without a single phone call to say, "Mum, I have an idea. Mum, would you be open to this? Mum, it's your house and I'd like to ask." She hadn't asked. She'd decided. I had a daughter who had decided things about my life and my home and my late husband's study because she thought she knew better, because I was 68 and widowed, and she'd somehow arrived at the conclusion that these facts entitled her to manage me. I thought about the shoes by the stairs. I thought about that rinsed but not washed coffee mug. I thought about knocking on a door in my own house. "I'll call you back," I said. I didn't call her back that night. I made myself dinner, leftover lentil soup, a piece of sourdough from the bakery on Bank Street, and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought, I am a thinker. Gerald used to say I had the patience to wait out any problem if I gave it enough quiet. He wasn't wrong. Some of my best decisions have come from sitting with a bowl of soup and saying nothing to anyone. Andrew came down around 7. He was polite, slightly uncomfortable, clearly aware that something had shifted. He offered to find somewhere else to stay. I told him that wasn't necessary, not yet, and that I appreciated his consideration. I meant it. He was a guest who hadn't asked to be placed in the middle of someone else's family arrangement. I slept reasonably well, which surprised me. In the morning I called my son-in-law. My daughter's husband, Patrick. We've always gotten along. He's a quietly decent man. An engineer, methodical, the kind of person who reads the manual before assembling furniture. I told him what I'd found and what my daughter had told me. He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't tell me either," he said. That told me something useful. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Not to sue anyone, not to make threats. I called because I wanted to understand, clearly and without my daughter's interpretation, what my rights were regarding my own property. My house is in my name. It has been in my name since Gerald and I bought it in 1993, and it remained in my name when Gerald died. I own it, entirely. Whatever my daughter had imagined she was doing, she had no legal authority to rent any portion of it to anyone. The lawyer, a calm woman named Ellen whose office was near the glebe, confirmed this. She also told me that regardless of whether my daughter had been depositing money into my account, I had not signed any lease. Andrew had no formal tenancy agreement. The situation, legally, was straightforwardly mine to resolve. I thanked her. I paid her for 45 minutes of her time, and I walked out into the October afternoon, which was cold and bright, the way Ottawa gets in October. The sky that particular blue that only shows up after the leaves have started to come down. I went home and I knocked on Gerald's door again. Andrew opened it. He looked like he hadn't slept especially well. I asked if I could come in and sit down. We sat, he on the edge of the narrow bed my daughter had apparently put in there at some point, me in Gerald's old reading chair that I hadn't moved because I couldn't bring myself to. I told Andrew the situation plainly. I told him that he had done nothing wrong and that I held no ill will toward him. I told him that I needed my house back, but that I was not going to put him on the street, and that I was giving him 6 weeks to find a new arrangement, longer than was legally required, because I'm not unreasonable. He was grateful. Genuinely, I thought. He said he wished he'd known. I believed him. Then I called my daughter and told her to come over. She arrived on a Saturday morning, a week later. She brought coffee from the cafe on Elgin, the good one, which told me she understood she was arriving in difficult territory. She set the cups on the kitchen table and she sat down across from me, and she looked at me with the expression she's had since she was 9 years old when she knew she was in the wrong. Slightly defiant, slightly ashamed, the chin up and the eyes not quite meeting mine. She started talking before I could. She said she'd been worried about me. She said the house was too large for one person and she didn't like the idea of me alone in it all winter. She said I didn't use the back room anyway, and the money would be helpful, and Andrew came recommended, and she thought if she asked me first, I would have said no out of stubbornness, and she just wanted to help. She was only trying to help. I let her finish. Then I asked her one question. I asked, "When in your life have I been unable to make a decision for myself?" She didn't answer. I told her I didn't need managing. I told her that widowed and alone and 68 did not mean incapable, did not mean passive, did not mean she got to start making choices about my property and my life and my home. I told her that I had run a household, raised a daughter, cared for a husband through 3 years of illness, returned to work as an administrative coordinator at 62 after Gerald died, managed my own RRSP and my own taxes and my own prescriptions and my own social life, and I did not require anyone to rent out my house on my behalf to protect me from the burden of a spare bedroom. She had tears in her eyes by the time I finished. Good. Not because I wanted to hurt her, because I wanted to understand that something had happened here that was not small. She had looked at my life and found it lacking, and had taken it upon herself to correct it. Quietly, efficiently, without asking, as though my preferences were an obstacle to be routed around rather than a voice to be heard. "I didn't think of it that way," she said. "I know," I said. "That's exactly what worries me." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. I let her. I'm her mother. There is a long history between us, longer than this moment, and love doesn't stop because someone has gotten something deeply wrong. But I kept my hand still under hers. I didn't turn it over. Not yet. I told her Andrew would be staying another 6 weeks, because that was the arrangement I had made, and I keep my arrangements. But after that, the decision about the back room would be mine. Mine to offer, mine to refuse, mine to sit empty for the next 20 years if I chose. She nodded. She said she understood. We drank the coffee she'd brought. It was good coffee. It almost made a normal morning out of an abnormal one. Almost. Before she left, she stood in the front hall, putting on her coat, and she said, "I did put the money into your account. All of it. It's yours." I thanked her. Then I told her what I planned to do with it. She looked up. I told her I was going to use it to book a trip. Solo. I'd been looking at a 10-day tour of the Maritimes that left from Halifax in the spring. I'd been thinking about it for 2 years, actually. Gerald and I had always talked about going to Cape Breton, and we'd never gotten there. I was going to go, by myself, on a bus tour full of strangers, which my daughter would find slightly horrifying, which was a secondary benefit. She opened her mouth. I watched her decide not to say whatever she'd been about to say. "That sounds nice, Mum," she said instead. There is growth in small moments. I recognized that one. I stood at the door and watched her walk to her car in the thin November light. She was wearing the blue coat I'd helped her pick out last winter at the Rado Center. I remembered standing in the store with her while she tried it on, turning in front of the mirror, asking if the color was too much. I'd said no. It wasn't too much, it was just right. She got in the car and pulled away. I closed the door. I turned off the hallway light. I always turn it off. And I went back to the kitchen and I washed the 2 coffee mugs and set them in the rack to dry, and then I sat down at the table with my phone and I opened the website for the Cape Breton tour. I'd been looking at the pictures for 2 years, the Cabot Trail in early spring, the sea. Gerald had wanted to see the sea from that road. I put in my name and my credit card number, and I booked a seat for one. Some things you wait to do because you're waiting for the right company, and then you realize the waiting was the mistake, and the company was always going to be yourself. The confirmation email came through while I was still sitting there. My seat was confirmed. I read it twice, then I set the phone down and looked at the kitchen, the familiar counters, the window above the sink, the afternoon light coming in the same way it had for 31 years, and I felt, for the first time in a while, entirely like myself. I've thought about that moment in the upstairs hallway more times than I expected to. Not with anger anymore. The anger was real, but it moved through me and left the way weather does. What stayed was something quieter, a kind of clarity about what had actually happened and what it meant. My daughter didn't rent out my home because she was cruel. She did it because she had quietly decided, without ever saying it out loud, that my judgment about my own life needed supervising. That's a particular kind of harm, the kind that comes wrapped in concern, that calls itself love. It's harder to name than cruelty, but it still takes something from you. What she didn't account for was that I had spent 68 years learning how to think, not just reacting, not just feeling, but actually sitting with a problem until I understood its shape. That Tuesday evening with my lentil soup, I wasn't being passive. I was doing what I've always done when something difficult arrives. I was giving it the time it deserved. There's a kind of intelligence that only works in stillness, and I've come to trust it. The people who've underestimated me in my life have almost always done so because they mistook my quietness for absence. I wasn't absent. I was deciding, and I think that matters, the deciding. Not the outcome, though the outcome was mine to choose. It was the act of choosing itself that needed to happen. When I called the lawyer, when I sat with Andrew and gave him 6 weeks rather than nothing, when I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table and told her the truth without cruelty, each of those was a choice made from somewhere steady inside me, not from fear of her opinion, not from the need to win, not from bitterness, from knowing what was right and doing it anyway. The booking of that Cape Breton trip, I know it looks small from the outside. $800, a bus tour, 10 days, but it was mine. That's what I was really booking, not a holiday, myself. The version of me that doesn't wait for permission to want things, doesn't arrange her desires around other people's comfort, doesn't mistake the shrinking of her life for the appropriate modesty of age. Gerald and I always said we'd get to Cape Breton. We didn't. I used to feel guilty about that, as though the not going was a failure of some kind. Now I think the going alone, in spring, with the Cabot Trail and the sea, is its own kind of honoring. Not a replacement, a continuation. My daughter is a good person who made a wrong choice. I believe that fully. The conversation we had didn't fix everything, and I'm not sure fixing is the right word for what happens between a parent and a grown child when something breaks. You rebuild, slowly, with honesty instead of pretending. You say the true thing even when the kind thing would be easier. That's what I tried to do, not to punish her, to keep her from doing it again, to someone else or to me or to herself. I closed my front door that November afternoon and turned off the hallway light and felt entirely like myself. That's not a small thing. At 68, after everything, feeling entirely like yourself is not a small thing at all.